Deal or no deal? Tariff threats from President Trump prompt the leaders of Canada and Mexico to make overtures. The implications and more today on the Texas Standard.
Texas Standard is a production of KUT Austin, KERA North Texas, Houston Public Media, and Texas Public Radio in San Antonio.
I'm David Brown. Texas does more business with Mexico than any other nation, and with 25% tariff threats now on the table, what should we expect? We'll take a closer look. Also, the Texas Public Utility Commission issues a report on CenterPoint Energy's much criticized response to Hurricane Beryl. We'll have details. Squaring economic data points with how voters felt going into this year's election. An educational oasis for some students, for others out of reach. A warning about community college deserts, plus much more, when the Texas Standard gets underway. Right after this. No matter where you are, it's Texas Standard Time on this second day of December 2024. I'm David Brown. Depending on the season of the year, our number one and number two trading partners often trade places. They're also our closest neighbors to the north and south, and for both, Texas is an important nexus. Canada is the country most often overlooked in this conversation, and Prime Minister Justin Trudeau knows it. With well more than a month to go before the swearing in of the U.S. president-elect, Trudeau last week made a trip to Mar-a-Lago to talk about Mr. Trump's threat to impose 25% tariffs on our two biggest trading partners. Trump is demanding changes to reduce the inflow of fentanyl, illegal migration, and trade deficits. Canada sends about 75% of its total exports to the U.S. Think cars, dairy products, paper goods, building supplies. And then there's Mexico. After a phone call between Trump and Mexico's new president, Trump wrote on social media that Claudia Sheinbaum had agreed to stop unauthorized migration across the border. For her part, President Sheinbaum told reporters she's confident that a potential tariff war can be averted, adding on social media that, quote, migrants in caravans are taken care of before they reach the border, end quote. That, according to the Associated Press. While much has been said about how economists agree that tariffs generally lead to higher prices, whether those tariffs would ever materialize is now in doubt, making the question of whether the tariff threats were just a bluff seem almost moot. Both Canada and Mexico, Texas's top trading partners, appear to be making moves to head off a worst-case scenario. For more, we're joined by Tony Payan. He's the director for the Center for the U.S. and Mexico at Rice University's Baker Institute for Public Policy. Tony, welcome to the Texas Standard.
Thank you, David. Happy to be here.
Is it known whether Sheinbaum actually agreed to make specific changes due to the tariff threat?
Well, we don't know. You know, Mr. Trump made a statement on his social media, and then Ms. Sheinbaum made a contradictory statement in her morning press conferences, which she has continued after Mr. López Obrador. And so we don't know exactly what the content of the conversation was. What we do know is that she is very concerned with three things, I think. Potentially the issue of trade and China. China's economic activities in Mexico are very important to the Sheinbaum administration. I think the second thing is obviously immigration. And then, of course, we are looking at the issue of fentanyl and drugs. That is going to be really important to consider for the coming months.
I was just reading a story in the New York Times over the weekend, and I'm sure you saw it as well. Mexican cartels lure chemistry students to make fentanyl. So clearly Mexico is dealing with a major problem in this regard. And I'm curious if the U.S. or if the Trump administration wants to do something about, let's take fentanyl, for example, wants to do something about this issue. How do you measure it? How do you gauge it? How do you know whether Mexico is, in fact, taking the steps that it can to deal with this issue?
Well, what is interesting here is that we're going to have to see the Mexican government arrest real criminals and, of course, politicians who are very much engaged in Mexico. And Mr. Trump has already threatened that he will actually name Mexican politicians who are collaborating with organized criminals. And so that could certainly be a good threat that Mr. Trump is going to issue. So it's going to be a lot about measuring how much fentanyl is making it to the U.S. streets, how much it costs, which the DEA can certainly measure, and of course, how many people get arrested in Mexico. And I think Scheinbaum has already said, we've arrested 15,000 drug traffickers and criminals in Mexico. We've already disbanded 2 major migrant caravans transiting through Mexico. And so it's going to be about the numbers. It's going to be a numbers game, I think.
Something a lot of Texans may not fully realize is just how important Mexico is when it comes to the parts and components critical to the U.S. auto industry. And of course, Texas has several auto plants, manufacturing plants here. How would tariffs on Mexican products affect this cross-border manufacturing supply chain? What could the implications be here, specifically for Texas, do you think?
Well, we know that the amount of trade between the two countries is $800 billion a year. Half of that, $400 billion, is essentially what we could call intra-firm trade, that is trade that occurs between manufacturing firms, that the parts that come from Mexico or come from the United States into Mexico to complete the cars and to complete the goods and that are traded, the kind of consumer goods that you and I buy at the store. So if tariffs are imposed, obviously that goes straight into the integration of these supply chains. Prices will certainly go up in the United States. It will affect Mexico as much as us consumers in the United States. So I don't think Mr. Trump will make good on those tariffs. I think he will, at the end, understand how integrated these two economies really are. But he has promised that he will pursue a strategy to attract more of that manufacturing into the United States. And so some of those tariffs may actually end up happening. But that will be a 2026 issue because the USMCA is supposed to be renegotiated, I guess, in July of 2026. So there'll be an opportunity for those tariffs to be negotiated at some point.
The USMCA being the deal that replaced NAFTA.
That is correct.
Tony Payan is the director for the Center for the U.S. and Mexico at Rice University's Baker Institute for Public Policy. We'll have more at our website, texasstandard.org. Professor, thank you so much for speaking with us on The Standard today. We certainly do appreciate it.
Thank you.
After Hurricane Beryl, Houston-based CenterPoint Energy came under fire for the way it handled outages. Governor Greg Abbott ordered the Public Utility Commission to put together a report on their response, and that came in last week. Andrew Schneider of Houston Public Media looked into the PUC's recommendations and what might be ahead.
One of the biggest areas the report identifies for improvement is that of communications. The commission called on lawmakers to codify a customer's right to speak with a live person to get updates on power outages and restoration times. Franklin Allaire of Katy lost power for more than 10 days after Beryl struck. He says he was able to speak with a live person most times he called, but the information he got was often far from helpful.
I think, a customer Bill of Rights is a great idea to, ensure that there are ways for customers like me and others to reach out and ensure that we get a real person who's aware of the situation.
The report also says utilities must improve communications with neighboring utilities, local governments, and emergency services as part of their preparations for major storms. And the report focuses on heading off problems that led to many of the outages during Beryl. Ted Curry is Director of Energy Studies at the University of Florida's Public Utility Research Center.
It looks like they're asking for a more standardized series of pole inspections and replacement, basically replacing poles that may not meet current standards for resilience to wind. Also, something the commission noted is that there is no standard for vegetation management in Texas.
Xanto Peabody lives in Kingwood. Storms regularly down power lines in his heavily wooded neighborhood.
Definitely maintenance around the lines has got to be a priority.
Like Franklin Allaire, Peabody was without electricity for 10 days after Beryl.
That's one of the things I'm hoping most for, is that the pathways for the lines will be maintained clear of vegetation that is going to short out the lines or knock the lines down in a storm.
The report puts responsibility for dealing with most of these problems on the utilities. Former Harris County Judge Ed Emmett is now an energy fellow at Rice University's Baker Institute.
CenterPoint has to act on it, basically. And I think they already are.
In a statement to Houston Public Media, CenterPoint says it's taking steps to protect against future hurricanes. The company said that it is, quote, implementing improvements recommended by an independent third-party expert and has already completed or begun 2/3 of their 77 recommendations. Again, Ted Curry.
To the extent that that's going to impact the costs for providing utility service, those costs are ultimately going to be borne by the people. But the people are also the ones that bear the cost of decreased quality of service and decreased access to service.
But the report also recommends the legislature approve tougher penalties for utilities when they fail to deliver. Xanto Peabody hopes his lawmakers are listening.
My understanding is that there's an up to $25,000 penalty for when it seems like the utility is not reliable enough. I think that's unbelievably too low.
This won't be the last time the PUC advises lawmakers on CenterPoint in the near future. It opened an audit into the utility amid charges that CenterPoint overcharged customers more than $100 million. PUC Chair Thomas Gleason says he wants to conclude the audit by April while the legislature is still in session. I'm Andrew Schneider in Houston.
And Wells Dunbar joins us now. He's our social media editor, and he's monitoring what Texans are talking about online. Wells, welcome.
Howdy, David. Outgoing President Joe Biden and his sweeping pardon of his son Hunter sparking lots of talk online this Monday. President Biden issuing a full and unconditional pardon for his son, whose legal woes include a federal conviction for illegally buying a gun and tax evasion. The move comes despite the president's past insistence that he would not use his pardon powers in Hunter Biden's case. On our Facebook page, Gene Itzkowitz says Biden lies, but no one cares because only Trump lies matter. The double standard is undeniable. Meanwhile, Savannah Arnold says she's not at all conflicted about Biden's pardon. This next administration promises to be lawless, cruel, and corrupt. And while we're on the subject of presidential pardons, John Nielsen, also via Facebook, notes that Trump pardoned a prison convict and then named him as our ambassador to France, referring there to Trump tapping Charles Kushner, the father of his son-in-law, for a diplomatic position. Trump pardoned the elder Kushner way back in 2020. That's just one of the stories we're keeping an eye on this morning, David. I'll be back with more later in the program.
Wells Dunbar will be back in about 35 minutes or so. In the meantime, let us hear from you. Look for Texas Standard on your social media platform of choice. A lot of soul-searching and finger-pointing among Democrats in the wake of losses on Election Day. One issue, messaging around money. While data suggested a robust and growing economy, many voters said the numbers didn't square with their own lived experience. What's behind the disconnect? More as the Standard continues.
Support for Texas Standard comes from the Texas Tuition Promise Fund and the Texas College Savings Plan, administered by the state of Texas. More on how each plan can help families start saving for future college expenses is at savenowforcollege.org.
It's the Texas Standard. I'm David Brown. Thanksgiving break is always a big one for college sports fans. On Saturday, number 3 Texas and number 20 Texas A&M renewed their historic rivalry for the first time since 2011. The Longhorns came away with a 17-7 win and will now play Georgia in Atlanta for the SEC championship with a possible run to the national championship. Other Texas Bowl-eligible schools include SMU, Texas Tech, Baylor, and TCU. In women's volleyball, the NCAA revealed their tournament bracket on Sunday. 9 Texas teams made the playoffs, according to WFAA in Dallas. Of those 9, 5 were seeded: Texas, Texas A&M, SMU, TCU, and Baylor. The unseeded teams are UT Arlington, UTEP, Texas State, and Texas A&M Corpus Christi. The tournament kicks off this Thursday, and of course, we'll keep you posted right here on the Standard.
Support for coverage of business comes from Texas Mutual Insurance Company, a workers' comp carrier dedicated to handling claims proactively to help injured employees get back on the job and policyholders get back to business. More at texasmutual.com/claims.
And you're listening to the Texas Standard. I'm Laura Rice. The statistics point to a steadily improving economy in 2024. Employment was up and inflation was down from its high pandemic levels. So why do so many consumers still say they're being hammered by high prices at the grocery store? And how did that mismatch between the numbers and people's real lives affect a presidential election where many voters said the economy was their number one issue? Nitish Pawa and Shirin Ali are associate writers for Slate, and they've tried to answer these questions and more. Nitish, Shirin, welcome to the Texas Standard.
Thanks for having us.
Well, we've talked to economists here on the Standard, and I know you did too, who point to a turnaround for many aspects of the economy since the pandemic, and that includes consumer inflation, but people aren't feeling that when they go shopping. Nitish, let's start with you. Where is the disconnect, do you think?
I think there's a couple things that play into this disconnect. One is that I think a lot of our traditional economic indicators, whether you want to point to the stock market, the consumer price index, or even like the unemployment rate, are not actually reflecting these days a lot of what is being felt on the ground, just in terms of the monetary pinch and what people are doing to get by. So just by way of example, one of the things that's gone wrong with the inflation gauge is that, unlike back in the 70s, it no longer includes stuff like mortgage rates or other debt rates, which have been pretty high for a lot of American families over the past couple of years, and have been even higher now in this time when the Federal Reserve has jacked up interest rates, in an attempt to tamp down core inflation, but it's still keeping mortgages and other such debt indicators pretty high. Another thing is that there's a lot of suffering in terms of like not being able to buy a house, not being able to get health insurance for your kids, no longer having access to a lot of the welfare programs that have been expanded in the wake of the coronavirus pandemic, stuff like the child tax credit, the boost to unemployment support. So with all that suddenly taken away as like prices stay high, as the economy, globally, slowly staggers back to a stable place, a lot of people are just feeling the pinch. Like, yeah, they may have, jobs, but they may be feeling very precarious right now.
Well, Shirin, you guys titled your Slate article, or it got the title anyway, "The Most Fatal Mistake of Biden's Term." You listed, or your co-author there did, just some of the things that actually the Biden administration did do post-pandemic, but what should have happened that didn't, to help bolster the economy?
I think that from the economists that, we spoke to when writing this piece, they really said that the Biden administration on paper really did everything that it could have to combat inflation. We saw that wage growth actually surpassed the rate of inflation, which is really like the number one way to fight inflation, which was great for the Biden administration. And so Claudia Sahm, one of the economists that I spoke to, she felt that the Biden administration's really their biggest mistake when dealing with inflation was really just being able to talk about it. Inflation is a really sticky subject. Obviously, consumers and voters don't want to be paying like $4 or $5 for a gallon of gas, and they're not happy when they go to the grocery store. And so having to really address that head on can be really challenging for any politician. And I think that generally the Biden administration struggled to really talk about the things that they had done to kind of help combat inflation. Particularly the Biden administration, they tapped into the Strategic Petroleum Reserve, and the economists that I spoke to really believed that that did help at the time to bring gas prices down a little bit. But Democrats didn't really talk about that.
I wonder, too, Nitish, if some of this comes down to people's psychology. Why is it that so many consumers continue to feel like their paychecks aren't going as far as they once did, and that politicians in office right now are to blame?
I think there is a great misperception that, the government can slowly, turn certain dials certain ways, and that will affect inflation. That will bring things back to normal. And I mean, as Sharon, mentioned, the Biden administration did a lot. That being said, again, we have to keep in mind, one, the inflation rate as we measure it now, the headline number that appears everywhere, does not include a lot of the debts that American families are still struggling that they're still trying to pay down. And frankly, there's a lack of communication from the Biden administration about what they had done, what effects were there that just didn't get through to the public, because there's always a lot of finger pointing, blame that goes upward, right?
Mm-hmm. Sharon, I wonder, Natisha said a lot of blame goes upwards, but I wonder if it might go the opposite way with a new administration moving in. Any thoughts you have on the change in Washington and whether President-elect Trump may be likely to get some credit for positive changes that were already underway?
Yeah, I mean, I think that inevitably happens a lot when new administrations take over. Economic policy takes time to take effect. So it's kind of a wait and see situation. And consumers have spent the last couple of years in shock, facing really high costs. But the reality is that the economists that I spoke to were really like, the bottom line is that Americans will just kind of need to start getting used to the new cost of goods. And the positive side of that is, wage growth has gone up. So most Americans should be able to begin affording the new cost of goods and the new normal.
Nitish Pawa and Sharon Ali are associate writers for Slate. We'll have a link to their reporting at texasstandard.org. Nitish, Sharon, thank you again.
Thank you.
Support for Texas Standard comes from the Texas Department of Agriculture, showcasing wild-caught Texas shrimp, sustainably and ethically sourced from Texas's own backyard. Texas Gulf shrimp varieties and recipes at wildcaughttxshrimp.com.
From the Texas Newsroom, I'm Alexandra Hart. Texas Children's Hospital in Houston says it is complying with an executive order by Governor Abbott that requires hospitals to ask patients about their immigration status. The hospital issued the statement after Abbott threatened to pull the hospital's funding because of a viral video by one of its doctors.
My proposal to everyone, and who's seen this, is just know that you do not have to answer this question.
Dr. Tony Pastor is a cardiologist at the hospital. He posted a TikTok video telling patients they don't have to answer questions about their immigration status. The video was eventually taken down, and the hospital says it is complying with the order and that Pastor does not speak on behalf of Texas Children's. Abbott issued the order earlier this year, saying he is collecting data on the cost of caring for people who are in the country illegally. The latest census data shows that Texas remains the top state for domestic net migration as the state's population continues to boom. KERA's Pablo Arauz-Peña reports.
An analysis by the Texas Demographic Center shows that California, New York, and Florida were the top states people moved from to Texas in 2023. Helen Yu is with the center.
We have seen that people who move to Texas tend to be people of younger working age population who usually tend to more likely to have a kid.
Other top sender states included Louisiana, Illinois, Washington, and Oregon. Meanwhile, about 478,000 people left Texas last year. Yu added that the state has a consistent annual growth rate of 1.6%. I'm Pablo Arauz-Peña in Dallas.
Violence against educators has become more common in recent years. National surveys show most teachers now say they've experienced physical violence at work. Susan Dvorak-McMahon chairs the task force that conducted the surveys.
We see these rates of being pretty substantial before COVID, going down during COVID. A lot of schools went hybrid or online, and then popping back up and even higher after COVID.
Nearly 60% of teachers surveyed in 2022 said they'd experienced physical violence from students during the current school year. Special education teachers in San Antonio's Northside ISD filed an internal complaint earlier this year saying they often get hurt at work. The Texas Longhorns will play their first SEC championship this Saturday after defeating rival Texas A&M over the weekend. The Longhorns will take on the Georgia Bulldogs in Atlanta. Georgia handed Texas its only loss during the regular season. I'm Alexandra Hart from the Texas Newsroom.
You're listening to statewide news from public radio stations across Texas. This coverage is only possible because of support from listeners like you. You can help sustain and grow Texas news coverage by donating to your local public radio station today.
33 minutes past the hour, Texas Standard Time. I'm David Brown. As parents of high school seniors can tell you, there are lots of factors to consider when planning what a graduate might do next to advance their education. For some, one of the biggest variables is how far they have to drive to get to class. That's according to new research on so-called community college deserts by the Annenberg Institute at Brown University. Joining us now to tell us more about this research, Sneha Day. She is education reporter for the Texas Tribune. Sneha, welcome back to the Texas Standard.
Thank you for having me.
In recent years, I've heard this term deserts appended to things like healthcare, food. Haven't heard of a community college desert before. What is a community college desert according to these researchers? How did they define this term?
Yes, so these researchers are considering a community college desert when students' public high schools are more than a 30-minute drive from the nearest community college.
And so what did they find overall? What's the sort of main takeaway here?
So they found that distance from a community college can be a big factor when students are deciding what to do after high school. In this research, they looked at where students went, Texas students went after high school by demographic. And they were finding that for Black, Hispanic, and low-income students, they were more likely to not go to college at all when they were in one of these community college deserts and were far away from a community college. In contrast, for like white, Asian, and higher income students, they were instead opting to enroll in a four-year university. So the distance from a community college was maybe nudging them to pursue that bachelor's degree.
Well, I'm curious, just comparing apples to apples, if you will. Is it that lower income students or students of certain demographics were going to community college less frequently if they lived in one of these deserts compared to, say, potential white students?
Yes, that's right. They're less likely to go to community college as well as going to a four-year college.
I see. How much has the growth of remote learning helped improve education access for potential students, especially those who live far from a community college?
It's a great question. Particularly after the COVID-19 pandemic, we're seeing a huge expansion of remote learning. Colleges, even after students were able to return to campus, they have really invested in remote learning. And so a lot of the students that I talk to that maybe are working a full-time job or are a parent and are balancing childcare, they are able to take classes entirely online. So this can really be a huge way to improve access to higher education in these rural areas.
Did the researchers proffer any recommendations for policymakers? How did the research come down on these questions? What now?
So I think going forward, one of the things that these researchers are saying that policymakers should really look at where college campuses are located, if there are deserts, looking at opening new campuses, and also as they're thinking about campus closures, I think this research just really underscores the importance of keeping community colleges in close proximity to students across Texas if we want students to continue to pursue higher education. One thing that is really an important bill to look back at is House Bill 8 that passed last legislative session and overhauled how community colleges were being funded altogether. And that was significant because Texas lawmakers put a lot of funding into small and rural colleges that were struggling to stay open. So I think this really underscores the need for those colleges to be staying open.
Well, you anticipated my next question because I was thinking, hasn't Texas done a lot when it comes to community colleges recently? There have been major sessions convened to talk about the role of community colleges and advancing that, advancing how they serve communities. Is it clear whether Texas is on the right track based upon what this research is telling us?
Absolutely. So House Bill 8, I think, was a really significant bill, not just for Texas, but across the nation, because it really was doing its own thing in rethinking how do we think about success at a community college. It's really now colleges now get their funding based on graduating students, not just enrolling students, and so making sure their students are like successful to the end and like getting to the final stage. And then I think the small and rural piece was they implemented like a base funding piece, which was all small and rural colleges got like a little bit of a boost so that they could stay open. And this was significant because during the pandemic, many of those colleges were having to look at their finances and say, hey, we might need to close. That was a real question that folks were really weighing. So that made the difference between colleges being able to stay open. I think going forward, people have questions for lawmakers about with this new funding model, are they going to continue to be able to put in money that matches what this model is asking of them to put in? And so I think this research really underscores the importance of that bill and continuing to make investments in that bill.
We've been speaking with Sneha Day. She's education reporter for the Texas Tribune, and we'll have a link to her reporting over at texasstandard.org. Sneha, thanks again for your time.
Thank you.
Support for Texas Standard comes from Texas Oncology, right here with cancer care at more than 280 locations around Texas, allowing patients to remain close to family, friends, and caregivers while they fight against cancer. More at texasoncology.com.
I'm Kenan Goldreyer, and you're listening to the Texas Standard. So I started an event in Austin, Texas called Monday Movement. We meet every Monday morning at Zilker Park on the main lawn for yoga from 7 a.m. to 7:45. Then we wrap up, walk to Barton Springs, and do a little cold plunge. People are off to work by 8:05. Oh, yeah.
Let's just get started. Let's get started laying all the way down on our backs, legs long, arms to the side, or if there's any other shape that you like to take here.
I started the event last year based on the idea that everyone dreads Monday. And that's so sad, because if you dread Monday, that basically means you dread your whole life, because your life starts on Monday, right? Your life can't start on the weekend. So I was like, okay, like what if there was something that on Saturday, peak of the weekend, you were looking forward to Monday? Like how awesome would that be? So I started, there would be about like 8 students that would show up. Most of them were my friends, a couple randoms, which was great. And then there was one video we posted online that got large amounts of views. And then that next week, the group size jumped from like 25 to like 75. And then the week after that, it jumped to 150.
Happy baby pose. Reach for the outside edges of your feet. You can also reach for the backs of your hamstrings.
A couple of challenges came up with Monday Movement, one of which was the permitting. It was difficult trying to figure out how to attain a permit for a group larger than 40. This is where the wonderful people at Austin Parks Foundation come in. Together, we were able to partner and get the event going.
Allow yourself to twist. Exhale.
This year, I started morphing Monday Movement into something bigger and greater. So I brought on an amazing partner. Her name's Kerrigan Whiteley. So now Monday Movement is an event run by our company we started together called Habitat. Really, we want Habitat to be a company that invokes personal development and stepping outside of your known bubble and like embracing the unknown. And that can come in the form of Monday Movement. That can come in the form of an international yoga retreat. But the idea is to really like inspire personal growth and development and get us out of our same old so that we can live an extraordinary life.
Child's pose. Press through your palms, send your hips back over your heels.
The biggest things people say about Monday Movement is they didn't think that they would enjoy getting up so early on Monday morning. Valid. Another thing a lot of people say about Monday Movement is that they felt very inclusive and they don't normally do yoga. So it's interesting that the people that come aren't those that I usually see in the studio, which is really cool. And it's a very different environment to be doing yoga in. You don't have 4 walls, you don't have a mirror, you don't have props. Dogs sometimes run through the group and lick people's faces. But I would say the biggest feedback is that people are glad they got up for it. a little can go a long way, and like transformation and change takes time. And so if you're trying something new and it's not going your way, or you're searching for something, don't try once and fail and then give up. You know, I think there were so many weeks in the beginning of Monday Movement where there would be so few people that would show up, or we would get rained out, or the grass was really wet, or just something kind of was getting in the way. And it would have been so easy to just be like, I'm done. And then we would never be here today, you know, and I would never have learned the things I learned or have met some of the people that I've met. And that would be so sad if that were true.
Asana, reach your arms up and overhead.
You should try to push a little farther than is comfortable and see what happens. I'm Ken Goldreyer, and you're listening to the Texas Standard.
It's the Texas Standard. I'm David Brown. Some LGBTQ military veterans fear President-elect Trump will roll back their hard-fought right to serve their country. Many of them served secretly at a time when they could have been kicked out of the military because of their sexual orientation. Andrew Dyer reports for the American Homefront Project.
At the LGBT Center in San Diego, 7 veterans are being added to the Wall of Honor, which recognizes the contributions of LGBTQ veterans in the community.
I thought it was a little strange at first because I really didn't think I really did anything to deserve it.
Robert Granite was drafted into the Army Reserves in 1969.
I went through BA, 2 master's degrees, a PhD, hoping to keep out from going to Vietnam, still got drafted.
Although Granite tried to avoid the draft, he still ended up choosing to serve.
It was either that or check off that little square that I was a homosexual. And in those days, if you were going into business, one did not do that. I mean, I would not have a career.
Granite served 4 years in the reserves, being careful to hide his sexual orientation. He says it was like having a sword of Damocles over his head because at the time, being gay in the military could mean jail. Serving in such a discriminatory environment was a challenge Pele Crone says she was up for when she joined the Army in 1978. She was one of the first women in an integrated platoon at boot camp, and she refused to stay in the closet.
I'm just me, and I don't care who likes me, or even if it means prison, even if it means my life. I'm not ashamed of who I am, and I just refuse to be quiet about it.
Crone says she was lucky her commanding officer supported her, but she says she still left the Army after she was repeatedly sexually harassed by male soldiers.
Being gay and being out wasn't the issue, it was more just being a woman. I would have been a lifer, I would have retired. But because of all the harassment, it was really horrific.
Some things have changed in the military since then. Don't Ask, Don't Tell took effect in 1994 and allowed LGBTQ troops to serve if they stayed closeted. Then, in 2011, they could finally serve openly. The Pentagon now has policies against discrimination and sexual harassment. But some here are worried about the future after Donald Trump was reelected.
There were going to be tough days ahead, and there are going to be people that we love and people that we know who are going to be hurt by what happens.
Democratic member of Congress Sarah Jacobs spoke to the group about what may be ahead. President-elect Trump has complained that the military is too woke. His nominee for Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth has spoken against transgender troops and DEI. Hegseth himself has been accused of sexual assault. Jacobs promised to protect the end of Don't Ask, Don't Tell, the end of the trans ban, and says it's important
that we protect every service member who wants to serve our country as their most authentic self.
In one of its final acts, the Biden administration in October proactively upgraded the discharges of veterans forced out under Don't Ask, Don't Tell. Other LGBTQ troops who were kicked out before 1994 still have to petition individually for discharge upgrades. That's what Marine veteran Randy Hedgecock successfully did last year. She was discharged after a year and a half due to what the Marines said was sexual perversion. Speaking from the lectern, she said the center's recognition restores honor, dignity, and respect to LGBTQ service members.
We found it necessary to hide ourselves. Leave no man behind. We were not only left behind, we were tossed out. Our service was not valued equal to any other military member. Left at the hands of those who hated us, it would all have been erased.
The discharge statuses of troops before 1994 are the subject of a federal lawsuit now working its way through the court. In San Diego, I'm Andrew Dyer.
That story was produced by the American Homefront Project, a public media collaboration covering American military life and veterans. Right, a question for you. Have you had a chance to check out Oye, Texas? It's a statewide bicultural newsletter written by editors and reporters from the Texas Newsroom, which is a collaboration between NPR and the public radio stations in Texas. Every week you get a rundown of the most interesting news, arts, and culture stories from all over the Lone Star State, compiled by and for a new generation of Texans. You're going to really like it. You can subscribe by going to oyetexas.org. We are fast approaching 49 minutes past the hour Texas Standard Time's a whole lot more just ahead. Stay with us. It's the Texas Standard. I'm David Brown. The Texas state legislature drifted to the right this election as more far-right members in the Republican Party won their seats. Many campaigned on issues related to gender identity and transgender rights. As we near the beginning of the 2025 legislative session, the Texas Newsroom's Blaise Gainey looks into what the political makeup of state lawmakers might mean for the LGBTQ community.
In the past few years, Republican-dominated state governments have proposed hundreds of bills with the LGBTQ community in mind, from Florida's Don't Say Gay bill, the gender-affirming Care for Minors ban, and one that centers around stopping minors from attending drag shows. Matt Lamb, who is a political science professor at Texas Tech University, says he doesn't expect Republicans to stop.
Given how some of the more moderate Republican members lost in primaries this past spring, I imagine they're going to have a more aggressive conservative agenda in this upcoming session.
He says a major factor in why Republicans are laser focused on this issue is because it's been successful in driving voters to the polls.
I imagine they are pursuing these sorts of pieces of legislation, or, if not legislation, then making this a big part of their rhetoric and their messaging, largely because it works.
He's got a point. LGBTQ issues were prevalent in virtually all campaigns run by Republicans this election cycle, and this was a very successful year for the party across the nation. But so was last year. In 2023, Texas Republicans passed bills that banned puberty blockers for transgender kids, restricted the college sports teams that trans athletes could join, and others. But that's not stopping them from filing more. Already, for the upcoming 2025 legislative session, lawmakers have filed more than 30 anti-trans bills. One requires kids wishing to play sports get a chromosome test. Another requires parents to sign off before their kid can join any club that promotes themes of gender identity. And another blocks people from using public restrooms that don't align with the sex listed on their birth certificate. Jonathan Saenz is the president and attorney for Texas Values, a group that backs all of the bills I just mentioned. Saenz says to him, these bills are a response.
I think the Democratic Party has gone too far or attached themselves. I think what you could likely see is a response this legislative session to the pendulum swinging way too far to the other side, to the left, if you will, on transgender issues and things related to that.
Jonathan Gooch is with Equality Texas, a group that works to advance rights for LGBTQ people. He doesn't think Democrats have gone too far, and he thinks Republicans have singled out a very small sector of the population. Take the bathroom bill, for example.
If a trans person needs to renew their driver's license, they should be able to use the bathroom while they're there. That shouldn't be a problem.
This isn't the first attempt to pass a bathroom bill. It's been up before and died before passing. But Lauren Gutterman, a professor in women, gender, and sexuality studies at the University of Texas at Austin, says even if bills don't become law, they still have an impact.
And even if they don't become law, they foster an environment of hatred. They foster increased discrimination, increased violence against trans people or people who are gender nonconforming, regardless of how they identify.
In fact, in 2023, lawmakers passed a bill that would have banned some drag shows, but it never took effect. It almost instantly faced a legal challenge that has prevented its implementation. Gutterman, a lesbian mother of 2, has been living in Texas since 2015 and has grown used to the constant attacks. She says the amount of legislation that is filed toward the LGBTQ community doesn't correlate with the actual percentage the group makes up of the population.
These bills are kind of punching down at an already vulnerable population.
The Williams Institute at UCLA's School of Law shows that only 4% of the population in Texas identifies as LGBTQ. I'm Blaze Gainey in Austin.
And you're listening to the Texas Standard. And Wells Dunbar is our social media editor. As promised, he's back with more listener comments. Wells, what are you seeing out there?
Hi, David. Well, echoing what we just heard, concern over rights for LGBTQ Texans top of mind for some of our friends and listeners. Via Facebook, Jessica Borner says she's wondering if my trans friends will be able to do basic adult things like get an apartment, vote, or get a job with recent state legislation and confusion around IDs for trans folks. She also adds she wonders if her undocumented friends will feel safe enough to go to the hospital if, God forbid, they need medical care. Jessica referring there to an executive order from Governor Greg Abbott, which took effect last month, requiring Texas hospitals that accept Medicaid or CHIP coverage to ask all patients about their immigration status.
We've reported on that.
Yeah. And worth noting again that question does not affect whether a patient receives medical care. Continuing to hear about that story I was talking about earlier in the show, President Joe Biden's pardon of his son, Michael Shutika, also on our Facebook page, says he's conflicted about Biden pardoning Hunter. He says, on one hand, I get it because Trump is clearly showing how corrupt his administration is going to be. Meanwhile, it's also an excuse for Trump and his cronies to do the same thing many times over. Really remarkable in terms of the breadth of that pardon and particularly the time period it specifies to potentially shield him from any prosecution under a Trump administration. So I'm sure we haven't heard quite the last of that story.
Nope.
Playing a little holiday. No, sir. Playing a little holiday catch up here. You know, we were off the air for a little while last week, so I got some Thanksgiving leftovers here. So does Sarah Roberts on our Facebook page. She's asking what type of soup should she make with a leftover cheese sauce from her holiday meal. John Barry's got a recommendation. Broccoli cheese might be an option. If you got any other ideas, send them in. I'll expedite them to Sarah over there.
Ditto cauliflower, by the way.
Ooh, yeah, I like the sound of that. Yeah. Meanwhile, Tyler Malloy says he's looking forward to next year's A&M and UT game. Talking about that 17-7 game Saturday where the Horns clinched their playoff spot. We heard about that in the roundup there. Fascinating. The Horns are going to be facing the Georgia Bulldogs again. I picked up on that one. Yeah, their only loss this season. So that'll be a little bit of a grudge match. Can't wait to see how that one plays out for sure as well.
Heck of a game, man. I mean, the instant replay machine sure got to work out. I mean, man, and some of those calls, were it not for that replay machine, I'm not sure that score would have been what it ultimately was. Fascinating game, absolutely fascinating.
Yeah, heck of a game, and one that obviously has been long in the making, and many Texas football fans, not Texas as in the University of Texas, but Texas football fans period, very much happy to see that rekindled rivalry. So yeah, that's going to bear fruit for many years to come. Another sign of this chillier weather, just evident out there. I'm just taking a look at the forecast there across Texas, seeing lots of current temps in the 50s and thereabouts. I love this comment from Marcia Graham. She says, "When I put dog coats on my two big dogs, it's like putting blankets on a horse." Thankfully, we're not there quite yet, but we may be soon enough. Who knows, David?
Got some big dogs there. We're out of time for the big broadcast. News continues 24/7 at texasstandard.org. The managing editor of The Standard is Gabrielle Munoz. Our managing producer is Laura Rice. Our executive producer is Rhonda Fanning. We'll be back here tomorrow, and we certainly do hope you can join us.
Philanthropic support for Texas Standard comes from Casey and Scott O'Hare, the Winkler Family Foundation, Lynn Dobson and Greg Wooldridge, Adrian Killam, and the George Huntington family.